Coming up on Avant Technology Insights with Ken Presti.
Most of the breaches took less than 10 steps to occur. In fact, most of them took less than 5.
Evading breaches can sometimes be as simple as making it just a little bit more difficult than the next company on the hit list. So says one of the contributing authors to the 2020 Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, or as it's more commonly known among us regular folk, the 2020 Verizon DBIR. It's a great report. We'll give you a taste of that in just a moment. Welcome to Avant Technology Insights. I'm your host, Ken Presti, Research Vice President of Avant Research and Analytics. The link between solving business challenges and cutting-edge technologies has become tighter and more complex than ever before. In this podcast series from Avant Research and Analytics, we help enterprise decision makers sort through the business case, the value, the challenges, and ultimately the bottom line of technology adoption. So listen to us at your desktop, take us in the car, tune in from the commuter train, or download us at the gate. You'll find us on Apple, Spotify, and Google, as well as at www.goavant.net/podcast. My guest today is a 20-year veteran of cybersecurity. He entered that space from industrial controls and SCADA, moved into investigations and incident response, and routinely consults for multinational corporations and government agencies. His team leads hundreds of cybersecurity investigations annually, ranging from financial fraud, cyber espionage, ransomware, industrial control systems, and cyber terrorism, among others. He's been interviewed by CNBC, The Wall Street Journal, ABC News, CBS News, and now, Avant Technology Insights with Ken Presti. Please welcome the director of the Verizon Threat Research Advisory Center, Chris Novak. Chris Novak, Director of Verizon Threat Research Advisory Center, thank you very much for joining us today. The subject here is the DBIR, the Data Breach Investigations Report. This is something that's been near and dear to my heart for a long time. I think I've read every one since the beginning. But for starters, why don't you give us a quick walkthrough on exactly what a DBIR is and what it's designed to do?
So the DBIR is actually a report that we created going all the way back to 2008 was the first version of it. And the whole concept of the creation of the report was really, breaches were happening and everybody wanted to figure out why. Everyone wanted to figure out, were they going to be the next one? They saw peers of theirs in the industry getting hit by massive breaches, and the executives, the board, were all reaching out saying, hey, we use the same tools, the same technology, we have the same data concerns. What is it that we're doing to make sure that this doesn't happen to us? And, the challenge we honestly faced at the time was that there was no source of information that people could go to figure out any of the answers to those questions. And so we said, you know what? We would have other customers calling us, we'd have media calling us, and we can never answer questions about an individual breach. It was, confidential. And so we said, let's take all the data from all of these thousands of breaches and anonymize them, aggregate them, and then pull out all the answers to those questions that people are always asking us. And so that's really where the first DBIR was really born from. And then since then, it's kind of blossomed. We kind of joke now where our DBIR is kind of growing up. It's now a teenager. It's now 13 years in the making, which is hard to believe.
Pretty soon they'll be ready to drive. You never know.
Scary thoughts.
So the first thing I noticed when I opened my copy of it was 3,950 breaches and 525 to be exact, incidents going on. I believe that's in the past year. Help me draw the distinction between what is an incident and what is a breach.
That's an excellent question. Yeah. So the incidents, obviously, the much bigger number that you mentioned, over 157,000 of them. And those are think of it as anything that triggered an alert or an alarm that requires you to investigate what happened and what does it mean. So that number is obviously the bigger of the two. That smaller number, which is almost 4,000 data breaches, are those incidents where after we've actually done the investigation, we've confirmed through looking at actual evidence that a breach of some kind of confidential information has in fact occurred. And actually, interestingly enough, both of those numbers are up significantly year on year. The number of incidents has actually gone up 50% year on year, and the number of data breaches has doubled.
Wow, that's a lot. So, and when you speak of breaches, is this just access, or is it both access and extraction of data?
It's typically both access and extraction of data. And to be honest, the line there has gotten really blurry over the last couple of years because as we see these various protocols like GDPR and CCPA, all these regulations around what you do with someone's typically personally identifiable information and your obligations to report if that data is compromised, in more and more cases, we're finding the distinction of what happens to the data is matters a bit less. And now most of these regulations are taking the approach of, even to some degree, if you think something might have happened or suspect something might have happened, you may still have an obligation to notify.
Right. So how much of this do you think is an actual increase in criminal behavior as opposed to just better reporting than we've seen in the past?
That's a really good question. So I actually think it's a bit of both. So one, I think no question about it, the numbers are up because the reporting has gotten better, and also because there are more places with more requirements to report, and so as a result, you're going to have more data coming in. So in fact, that's one of the things I say when I talk about the fact that the numbers have gone up year over year. I try to caution folks that it doesn't necessarily mean that they've gone up because the landscape has gotten so much worse. They may have gone up partially because the reporting has increased or has improved because it's been required by more entities and more places. But there also is the fact that we also believe that an element of that is the sheer quantity of them is also going up because we're seeing that in many of these cases, the jurisdictions and the landscapes where these threat actors operate, they can do so in a lot of cases with relative ease. You know, in the United States, we've got a good prosecutorial landscape, but in a lot of other places, we don't necessarily see that as being as mature.
Does it make sense to draw a distinction, or is it even useful to do so, between the breaches that are caused by actual cyber criminals, the bad guys, as opposed to your well-meaning in-house person who simply makes a mistake and exposes something?
You know, I do think that there is a useful distinction to draw there. And I think part of it is when we look at what we recommend organizations do to protect themselves, they need to consider both, right? If you just look at, there's the criminal that wants to break into your car and steal something versus, well, the owner of the car just left the door unlocked and opened, and it just makes it an easy crime of opportunity or something like that. And so, we do typically see when we look at the overall data, the majority of the threat actors are actually external. So about 70 to 80% are coming from the outside. They're not users that are accidentally doing something that lead to these events. They're external criminal groups or nation states that are, they're bent on making this happen. But then a lesser percentage of them, about 30% or so, is internal. And then that is further divided into that category of I accidentally clicked on something I shouldn't have and a bad thing occurred versus I'm a malicious, quote, insider that actually intended to cause harm. So if you kind of cut that down, you're probably looking at, 10 to 15% in either of those categories.
So, if we look at the full landscape of the various threats, what would you say are the more common types to worry about, or perhaps even the most insidious? If I am an enterprise decision maker listening to this podcast, what are the threats that you feel I really need to focus on and really need to address?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things there. One is social engineering continues to be very much on the forefront of a lot of what we see. In fact, when we analyze these things, we see that, social engineering plays a role in roughly a quarter of all these events. And so as a result, there's an element of securing the human, right?
Mm.
Another piece we also look at is the human error factor. We've seen a fairly steady increase in human errors. Just simply, hey, I intended to block something, and instead we set the rule to allow it. And so bad actors were able to access things that should have been off limits all along. And we also have been trying to raise the education level around things like organizations doing cloud transformation kind of projects. And I want to be really clear that I'm not in any way suggesting that the transformation or moving to cloud or platform as a service or any of those things are in any way bad or insecure. That's certainly not the case. Typically, the issue that we're seeing come out of a lot of that is the organizations either don't have the right resources or those resources don't have the right experience to secure that apparatus or do the transformation in a manner where security is front of mind. So we move something from a really safe place to a place where we forget to put locks on the doors or close the doors and windows. And as a result, they get hit and knocked over by these cyber criminals.
We also hear a lot about ransomware these days. Where do you think that stands in the overall scheme of things? And my favorite ransomware question, and I've bounced this off a number of people over the past several months, is do you pay it or you don't pay it? There's decent arguments on both sides of that equation.
Excellent question. So I'll start with that last one first. Do you pay it or you don't pay it? And
Mhm.
I ideally, I'd like to say you don't pay it. And I think that just comes from a deeply philosophical feeling of if we start paying more and more ransoms, we will probably see more and more ransom activities because the threat actors will feel like it works. They will feel like, hey, this is a good source of funding. And obviously, every little bit that they can use from one, they can use to fuel their efforts to do others. But I also understand the fact that for some businesses, depending on how well or poorly they may have planned for certain ransomware type of incidents, they may feel that they're really stuck between a rock and a hard place. And as much as they don't want to pay, it's a question of what happens to their business if they don't pay. So usually what we're doing is we're having those kinds of conversations with customers saying, let's put the philosophical aside and look at it through the lens of business. What does your kind of risk equation look like if you weren't to pay and these systems became unusable forever? What's the risk to the business? And if you do pay, there's the risk you will be targeted potentially again in the future because people know you might pay, but you may have certain operations that are more easily ongoing. And then obviously all that comes back to how do we try to better plan and prepare for it, right? So we're finding that more and more organizations are reaching out and asking for ransomware tabletop exercises, ransomware executive breach simulations, and overall just looking at and evaluating their ransomware playbooks and runbooks so that they can hopefully just be in a position of saying, look, we can rebuild from backups. We've had plans in place to prevent this from growing out of control, such that paying isn't even something that they need to consider. And kind of going more towards the earlier part of what you were asking, ransomware continues to be a very big piece of the overall equation from the data breach landscape. We kind of look at it a little bit different because most traditional ransomware is not typically trying to steal the data. So you don't necessarily often have an exposure in that no one has seen the confidential information and typically it hasn't been exfiltrated, but it's still unusable to you. And one of the interesting things when we look at this past DBIR, we found was that there were so many ransomware cases that it actually had a skewing effect on some of our other statistics. So I'll give you one example. Over all the years we've been doing this report, we've been looking to see what the average time was for a victim to discover they've had a breach. And before ransomware came on the scene, the average time to discover you've had a breach was about 8 months, which is a pretty long time for someone to be kind of rooting through your IT goodies. And when ransomware came on the scene, it changed things because when it happens, it's immediate. A screen comes up that says this ransomware has infected your system, paid this much Bitcoin to this address in 72 hours, or your data's gone forever. And so now, when we actually crunched the data last year for how long it takes organizations to discover that they've had a breach, we found that almost all of them discovered it in days or less. And in reality, it was because ransomware made it so immediate. If we take the ransomware cases out of the equation, we actually find that we're still way out in the months category, about 7 or 8 months still. So it's had a skewing effect on it because of the quantity of them.
Let me go back to something you said a moment ago. And I mean, it struck me that, wow, it makes sense. You can actually war game this stuff and make sure that, that your responses are in line with what you need to do. Is that becoming more prevalent? And how do you learn how to simulate these things in a meaningful way?
Yeah, it is absolutely. In fact, it's probably one of the most popular asks we see, which is it's kind of ironic because years ago, when we first started getting into this particular area of incident response and kind of crisis management, it was all reactive. Nobody really wanted to prepare for these events. People were, if they were contracting with us, they were contracting with us for in the future, if something were to happen, I want to have the contract ready, but it's probably not going to happen to me. But just in case, let's have a contract in place so you can help me if I have a breach. And now that's kind of morphed, and people are going, it's kind of like the ounce of prevention versus the pound. And I think that they're looking at it and saying, hey, we can actually try to get ahead of this a bit more and actually take some preventative measures. And I think part of the reason why people are looking at it that way is they're seeing the real teeth and consequences and financial impacts of breaches and saying, you know what, if I have to invest a little bit now to be better prepared, maybe it's worth it, because if I can avoid that big breach, or maybe we can't avoid every breach, but if we can make all of those breaches smaller, more manageable, more contained, the impacts to the business will be a lot lighter. And so I think that's the reason why we're seeing so many more of these tabletops and breach simulations. And honestly, the only reason we've really been able to do a good job of those is we've seen so many of them through the last decade that we've been able to build playbooks off of very realistic, situations. I tell people that a lot of what we do kind of reminds me of being in the medical field. If you're training med students on what to do, you have doctors who are very experienced, who have been through it, and you have cadavers or other, test dummies, if you will, to actually practice on so that you can know what it's like. And the doctors can throw real curveballs at you that you might really face in surgery so that you can practice in a circumstance where you're not going to cause more harm, so that when you get into the real meat of a ransomware case, you're not sweating it. This is like what you practiced and you're ready for it.
Yes, you trained for this, and this is what you're ready for.
Yeah.
I want to read a quote from page 12 of the report. And for anybody out here who is thinking that this report might be dry and analytical, let me dissuade you right here. Okay, page 12. Malware has been on a consistent and steady decline over the last 5 years. Why is that? Has malware just gone out of fashion like poofy hair and common courtesy? Help me unpack that. Why do you see malware in an overall decline? Have they just moved on to other things?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the reality of it is that malware has declined because we've seen organizations make better choices and investments in things like antivirus and endpoint detection and response capabilities. So they're doing a much better job of actually being proactive to detect, detonate, and destroy some of these things before they have the ability to actually run rampant in their environment. The other thing that we've also seen play a fairly healthy role in it is the integration of things like threat intelligence, where instead of you waiting for something to hit you to learn about it, you plug into a threat intelligence feed where you're basically, the best way to describe it is you're getting real time news updates from entities all over the world that are experiencing cyber attacks. So the moment an entity in Japan or Australia or New York or Germany sees something, that data can feed back and essentially be shared and disseminated, such that if you now start to see those kinds of attacks, you already have context and knowledge and know what to do with them.
Okay, so as the data was coming in, and I mean, I'm in this general line of work too, so I can see the incrementals on our own research as we come in. Was there anything in particular that jumped out at you in terms of an aha moment, or gee, that really validates what we've already thought, or hey, I never looked at it this way, or why the hell is this happening this way?
I think probably one of the areas that I think was most interesting this year when I looked at the data was we had put together research in an area that we had called unbroken chains and path based attacks. And ultimately, it validated a concept that I think everybody in IT security believed had to be real. But once you see the visual of the charts and the data, you go, wow, okay, it's not just a hunch or a gut feeling, but the numbers actually back it up. And what that talks about in the report is the fact that security in layers or defense in depth type strategies actually do work. Because what we did was we plotted out the number of breaches that were successful. And then along the other axis, we looked to see how many steps were required for that breach to happen. And what we found was that most of the breaches took less than 10 steps to occur. In fact, most of them took less than 5. And so it kind of really dovetails nicely with that concept of, if we can throw a few more layers, a little bit more segmentation, some other security controls in place, every little speed bump we put between the threat actor and our sensitive data is likely going to cause the threat actor to go in another direction. And sometimes people may hesitate to believe that, because they'll say, hey, that entity has got so much data, why would anyone give up after 5 or 6 steps? But the reality of it is, what we find is these threat actors are human, just like you and I. They want to take the path of least resistance. And if you consider the fact that the majority of the cyber attacks are financially motivated and are typically opportunistic, going back to kind of the earlier conversation where I said, anyone who's kind of ever experienced a break into, say, their car or their home, they talk to the police and they'll say, hey, do you have any guess as to why they targeted me? And the police will almost always tell you they didn't target you. They hit everybody on the block. They were just looking for any car or house where the door was unlocked, and they took whatever they could get. And so this validates a lot of the same thing that we've been seeing, is that you could be the biggest organization in the world, but if it's 5 or 6 steps to get in the door, they're probably moving on to someone else, because in that amount of time, they can knock over 10 other IP addresses and steal whatever data is behind them.
Apply the concept of defense in depth for me to, somebody who's using a lot of cloud-based applications. We're used to thinking of defense in depth at the data center level, and now we're starting to see it become more widely accepted, or at least more widely discussed at the cloud level, as cloud security becomes more prevalent and stronger. Um, what do you see happening there in terms of security experts building a defense in depth point perspective and point of view there?
Yeah, I think that is still a very viable approach on the cloud side. And honestly, to some degree, I've actually been finding organizations feel that it is easier to do at the cloud level than it has been at the data center level, because most of what we would typically deploy, whether it's, the layers of firewalls or web application firewalls or multi-factor authentication or other network segmentation forms, data encryption, many of those things in our internal data centers were more complex to build. You had to have the rack space and the system. Someone had to manage the cabling and the cooling and all these things. And every time you brought something in, you kind of needed to reconfigure the whole picture of how it all fits together. Whereas on the cloud based side, so much more of that, if not all of that, becomes virtual. So adding a WAF, adding this or that technology becomes more like clicking an option button in a portal to enable it. And then it's just a matter of configuring it, and it's there. And it becomes just a matter of where in my network schema, in my diagram, does it sit. Now, I don't want to make it sound trivial that, in a day you can have everything done. It's still hard work. But the reality of it is, with it, much more of it being virtual, I think it also makes taking advantage of certain technologies a little bit easier for some, whereas maybe previously the data center model was more challenging.
So it's a great report, the DBIR. I really enjoyed going through it. And, we've only scratched the surface here. There's a ton of vertical specific data in here as well. So I think it would be almost required reading for anybody in the security space, obviously, but also in overall IT. How do we get a copy of the report?
Yeah, the easiest way to get a copy is just to go to our website, enterprise.verizon.com, or for that matter, you can just Google for Verizon DBIR, and I can almost guarantee you it'll be the top hit there for you to click on. There is both the full featured report, which is probably 100 plus pages, and then there is also an executive summary version for folks who may look for a bit lighter of a read.
Chris Novak, Director of Verizon's Threat Research Advisory Center, thank you very much for joining us today. Lots of great information and a fantastic report. So congratulations to you and your team, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you. My pleasure.
You've been listening to Avant Technology Insights, featuring information and opinions on how key technologies can be leveraged to solve business problems. Avant Technology Insights is a service of Avant Communications, a platform for IT decision-making. All opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and the host. For more information, please feel free to download our research reports and other resources at www.goavant.net. That's www.goavant.net. For Avant Research and Analytics, this is Ken Presti.